Sarah Bennett looked at her diamond-studded watch as her black Mercedes S-Class pulled up to the private terminal at Los Angeles International Airport. It was 7:30 a.m. on a bright Tuesday morning. The early California sun sparkled off the sleek private jets parked on the tarmac, their metal bodies gleaming like new coins. "Thank you, David," she said to her driver of 5 years as he opened the car door. Sarah stepped out, her designer heels clicking against the polished concrete. At 35, she carried herself with the confidence that came from building a billion-dollar investment firm from the ground up. The morning breeze gently touched her face as she adjusted her navy blue Armani suit. Her dark skin glowed with natural beauty, enhanced by minimal makeup. Her braided hair was styled professionally, pulled back in a neat bun that spoke of elegance and authority. David retrieved her Louis Vuitton luggage from the trunk. "Will you be returning on Thursday, Ms. Bennett?" he asked, knowing her usual schedule. "Yes, the meeting in New York shouldn't take more than 2 days," Sarah replied, checking her phone. There were already 20 new emails since she last looked 15 minutes ago. Being the CEO of Bennett Capital meant the work never really stopped. As she walked toward the terminal entrance, Sarah noticed how quiet it was compared to the main airport terminal. This was one of the things she loved about private aviation: the peace, the efficiency, the absence of long lines and crowds. The glass doors of the terminal reflected her image, a successful black woman who had broken every ceiling that society had tried to place over her head. Sarah smiled, remembering how far she'd come. Growing up in a middle-class family in Detroit, her parents had taught her that education and hard work were the keys to success. Her father, a high school mathematics teacher, and her mother, a librarian, had sacrificed everything to send her to the best schools. Now, at 35, she was not just successful, she was changing the face of the investment banking world. Her phone buzzed with a message from her assistant, Jessica. "Board members confirmed for 3 p.m. tomorrow. Market reports ready in your digital folder. Jet is fueled and ready. Weather clear in NYC." Sarah typed back a quick "perfect, thanks," as she approached the security checkpoint. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, creating patterns on the marble floor. A few other executives were already there, most of them in suits similar to hers, though she noticed she was the only person of color in sight. It wasn't an unusual situation in her line of work. She pulled out her credentials and ownership papers, not that she usually needed them. Most of the staff at this terminal knew her well. After all, she was one of their biggest clients. The Bennett Capital logo on her private jet was a familiar sight here. 2 businessmen ahead of her were quickly waved through by the security guard. Sarah noticed this guard was new. She hadn't seen him before. He was a middle-aged white man with graying hair at his temples, his uniform pressed and crisp. His name tag read, James Miller. As she stepped forward, Sarah gave her usual warm, professional smile. She'd learned early in her career that a smile could open doors, even if sometimes those doors seemed determined to stay shut. She reached for her ID, ready to present it along with her flight documents. What happened next would not only change her day, but would set in motion a chain of events that would impact the entire private aviation industry. Sometimes, Sarah would later reflect, the biggest changes come from the most unexpected moments. And this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but ordinary. Little did Sarah know, as she stood there in her perfectly tailored suit, holding her designer briefcase, that she was about to face a challenge that had nothing to do with business strategies or market fluctuations. This challenge would test not just her patience, but her ability to transform discrimination into opportunity, aid into hope, and ignorance into education. The security checkpoint stood before her, and behind it, James Miller adjusted his stance, his eyes narrowing as she approached. The next few minutes would spark a story that would eventually make headlines across the country. The moment Sarah stepped up to the security checkpoint, James Miller's entire body language changed. He straightened his back and put his hand up in a stopping motion, even before she could show her ID. "Excuse me, miss," Miller said, his voice carrying a tone that was anything but polite. "The main terminal is that way." He pointed toward the regular airport entrance, about half a mile away. Sarah kept her professional smile in place. She'd dealt with similar situations before, though not recently, and certainly not at her own private terminal. "Actually, sir, I'm in the right place. I have my credentials right here." She reached into her designer bag to pull out her documentation. Miller stepped forward, creating a physical barrier between Sarah and the security gate. "Look, this is a private terminal," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "For private jet owners and their approved guests only." His eyes moved from her face to her expensive suit, clearly making assumptions despite her obviously wealthy appearance. "Yes, I'm aware," Sarah replied calmly, though she could feel her heart beating faster. "If you'll just check my documents." "Ma'am," Miller interrupted, his voice getting louder. "I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't." A few heads turned in their direction, and Sarah noticed some of the other passengers watching the scene unfold. Sarah took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. "Sir, I understand you're doing your job, but I am exactly where I need to be. My name is Sarah Bennett, and I'm the owner of—" "Owner?" Miller let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Listen, if you're looking for a cleaning position or catering service, those entrances are around the back." His words hung in the air, heavy with prejudice. The terminal had grown quieter now. Other travelers had stopped to watch, some with uncomfortable expressions, others with looks of concern. A young white executive who had just been waved through was now standing still, his phone in his hand, clearly recording the interaction. Sarah felt a familiar feeling in her stomach, a mixture of anger, hurt, and determination. She fought too hard and come too far to be treated this way. Still, she kept her voice steady and professional. "Mr. Miller," she said, reading his name tag again, "I'm going to try one more time. I own the Gulfstream G650 parked in Bay 7. Here are my credentials, my ownership papers, and my identification." She laid the documents on the security desk, her movements deliberate and calm. Miller barely glanced at the papers. "Anyone can fake documents these days," he said, pushing them back toward her. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call airport security." Just then, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Jessica, assistant. She answered it, putting it on speaker deliberately. "Ms. Bennett." Jessica's voice came through clearly. "I just wanted to confirm that the jet's interior has been arranged according to your preferences for the New York meeting. The pilots have filed the flight plan, and the catering you requested for the board members has been loaded." Miller's face twitched slightly, but he held his ground. "That doesn't prove anything," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Sarah ended the call and looked Miller directly in the eyes. "Mr. Miller, I'm going to give you one last opportunity to check my documentation properly. After that, I will have no choice but to contact the terminal management, the airport authority, and my legal team, in that order." The morning sun continued to stream through the terminal windows, creating a spotlight-like effect on the scene. Other passengers had stopped pretending to mind their own business and were openly watching now. Some had their phones out, recording everything. Miller's face had turned red, but his prejudice still outweighed his growing uncertainty. He reached for his radio, about to call for backup, not realizing that in the next few minutes, his entire world was about to be turned upside down. What he didn't know was that among the watching passengers were 3 members of Sarah's board of directors, who had arrived early for the same flight, and they had seen everything. The tension in the private terminal had reached its peak. Sarah stood her ground, facing Miller's discriminatory behavior while more people gathered around them. The morning sun that had seemed so pleasant earlier now felt harsh and hot through the terminal's glass windows. "That's it," Miller announced, reaching for his radio. "I'm calling security to remove you from the premises." His hand shook slightly as he lifted the radio to his mouth, but his eyes still held that same look of prejudice. Before he could speak into the radio, a tall man in an expensive gray suit stepped forward from the crowd. "That won't be necessary," said Michael Thompson, one of Bennett Capital's senior board members. "I can vouch for Ms. Bennett, seeing as she signs my paychecks." Miller's face reddened even more. "Sir, please stay back. This woman is trying to access a restricted area." "This woman," another voice called out, "is Sarah Bennett, the CEO of Bennett Capital." Patricia Rodriguez, another board member, moved to stand beside Sarah. "And I suggest you think very carefully about your next words." But Miller, despite the mounting evidence of his mistake, doubled down. "Anyone can claim to be a CEO," he said, his voice getting louder. "For all we know, this could be some kind of security breach. I'm just doing my job." Sarah felt all eyes in the terminal on her. Some passengers were openly recording the scene on their phones now. She could already imagine the viral videos and news headlines this would create. Yet, she remained perfectly composed, her expression neutral but determined. "Mr. Miller," Sarah said calmly, "you haven't even looked at my identification properly. You took one look at my face and made assumptions about who I am and where I belong." She gestured to the other executives who had passed through security earlier. "Did you ask any of them for detailed documentation?" The security guard shifted uncomfortably, but still didn't back down. "That's different," he muttered, not quite meeting her eyes. "Different how, exactly?" Sarah asked, her voice clear and steady. "Different because they fit your image of what a jet owner should look like. Different because their skin color matches your expectations." The terminal had fallen completely silent. Even the usual airport announcements seemed to have paused, as if the building itself was holding its breath. James Chen, the third board member present, stepped forward. "I've seen enough," he said, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling terminal management right now. This is absolutely unacceptable." Miller's face had gone from red to pale. I'm just following protocol," he stammered, but his voice had lost its authority. "Protocol?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Is it protocol to profile passengers based on their race? Is it protocol to refuse to check proper identification? Is it protocol to suggest that I should use the back entrance for cleaning staff?" Several gasps came from the onlookers. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Lawsuit incoming." Sarah held up her hand for silence. Despite the humiliation she'd endured, she remained dignified. "Mr. Miller, I don't want your job," she said quietly. "What I want is for you, and everyone else, to learn from this moment." Just then, the terminal manager, Robert Hayes, came running toward them, clearly alerted by multiple calls. His face showed pure panic as he recognized Sarah, one of their most valuable clients. "Ms. Bennett, I am so sorry about this." Hayes was almost out of breath. "Please, let me handle this situation immediately." But Sarah raised her hand again. "Mr. Hayes, before you take any action, I have a different proposal in mind." She turned to face the crowd of onlookers, many still recording. "What happened here today isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been judged based on their appearance rather than their credentials." Miller stood frozen, his radio still in his hand, as Sarah reached into her briefcase. She pulled out a business card and placed it on the security desk. "When you're ready to learn why you were wrong today," she said to Miller, "call this number. Instead of ending your career, I'd rather help you change your perspective." The crowd watched in amazement as Sarah Bennett, CEO of Bennett Capital, turned what could have been a moment of pure humiliation into an opportunity for change. But nobody in that terminal knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The private terminal buzzed with tension as terminal manager Hayes frantically apologized to Sarah. But before he could continue, Sarah's phone rang again. The caller ID displayed New York Stock Exchange, Chairman. Sarah answered the call on speaker, her eyes still fixed on Miller. "Good morning, Mr. Richardson," she said calmly. "Sarah, just checking if you're on your way. The entire board is excited about Bennett Capital's acquisition of Vista Aviation. It's not every day someone buys a $2 billion private jet company." The chairman's enthusiastic voice echoed through the now silent terminal. Miller's face turned ash white. The radio in his hand dropped to the floor with a loud clatter. "I'm actually having an interesting morning at the terminal," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "It seems there's been some confusion about whether I belong in the private aviation world." The chairman laughed. "Confusion? You're about to own one of the largest private jet companies in the world. Speaking of which, the press is already gathering here. Everyone wants to cover the story of the youngest black woman to make such a significant acquisition in aviation history." Several people in the crowd gasped. The young executive who had been recording everything whispered to his friend, "Did he just say she's buying Vista Aviation?" Sarah ended the call and looked around the terminal. The morning sun now seemed to illuminate her with an almost ethereal glow. "Mr. Miller," she said softly, "would you like to know what's in the briefcase you were so suspicious of?" Without waiting for an answer, she opened her designer briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. "These are the final papers for my company's acquisition of Vista Aviation, the company that, ironically, operates this very terminal." The terminal manager, Mr. Hayes, looked like he might faint. "Ms. Bennett, I had no idea the acquisition was already final. We weren't informed. It becomes official at noon today, Sarah explained, her voice carrying across the hushed terminal. Which means in about 4 hours, I won't just be a private jet owner using this terminal. I'll own the terminal itself. Miller's legs seemed to give out, and he had to grab the security desk for support. The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger, with airport staff and other passengers gathering to witness the unfolding scene. Sarah turned to address everyone present. Let me be clear about something. Success doesn't have a color. Leadership doesn't have a gender. And assumptions, she paused, looking directly at Miller, can be very expensive mistakes. Patricia Rodriguez, her board member, stepped forward with her own phone out. Sarah, social media is already exploding. The videos of this incident are going viral. CNN is calling for a statement. But Sarah wasn't interested in public humiliation. Instead, she did something unexpected. She walked over to the security desk where Miller stood trembling and placed her hand on the final acquisition papers. Mr. Miller, she said, her voice gentle but firm, today could have gone very differently. I could have had you fired. I could have called the media. I could have filed a lawsuit. But none of that would solve the real problem, would it? The security guard finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. Miss Bennett, I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything. Just listen, Sarah replied. Tomorrow, when this terminal officially becomes part of Bennett Capital, we're going to make some changes. And you, Mr. Miller, are going to help me make those changes. The crowd watched in amazement as Sarah Bennett, the woman who had been racially profiled just minutes ago, turned to Terminal Manager Hayes. Mr. Hayes, please don't fire Mr. Miller, she said, causing another wave of surprised murmurs. Instead, I want him to be the first participant in our new diversity and inclusion training program. Sometimes, the best way to change the system is to change minds one at a time. As the sun rose higher in the Los Angeles sky, casting long shadows across the terminal floor, no one could have predicted that this moment of revelation would become a turning point, not just for James Miller, but for the entire private aviation industry. The story of what happened next would be told in boardrooms and newspapers across the country, but it began right here, with a choice between revenge and reformation. The next few hours in the private terminal transformed into something no one had expected. News of the incident spread quickly through the aviation community, and support for Sarah Bennett came pouring in from every direction. By 10 a.m., just 2 hours after the confrontation, the terminal's waiting area had filled with unexpected visitors. CEOs from neighboring private aviation companies, many of whom were scheduled to be Sarah's competitors by the end of the day, arrived to show their solidarity. What happened here today is unacceptable, announced Richard Martinez, CEO of Pacific Aviation, addressing the growing crowd. But what's more remarkable is how Ms. Bennett chose to handle it. He turned to Sarah with genuine admiration in his eyes. You're showing us all a better way forward. Miller remained at his post, required to continue his shift, but looking more uncomfortable with each passing minute. Every time the terminal doors opened, another influential figure walked in. Even the airport's chief of security had arrived, personally apologizing to Sarah. Then something unexpected happened. A group of cleaning staff, maintenance workers, and baggage handlers, mostly people of color, gathered near the entrance. They hadn't said anything, but their presence spoke volumes. Many had experienced similar discrimination, but had never been in a position to challenge it. Maria Gonzalez, who had been cleaning the terminal's floors for 15 years, finally stepped forward. Her voice shook as she spoke. Ms. Bennett, for years we've watched people treat us like we're invisible. Today, you stood up not just for yourself, but for all of us. Sarah walked over to Maria and took her hands. No one is invisible, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. And starting tomorrow, that becomes official policy. The terminal's atmosphere had completely changed from the tense confrontation earlier. People who would normally hurry past each other stopped to talk. Executive assistants chatted with security staff. Pilots joined conversations with maintenance workers. Sarah's phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages of support. Major news networks were requesting interviews. Civil rights organizations were calling to offer assistance. But what touched her most was a text message from her father, the high school math teacher. Baby girl, your mother and I are seeing the videos. You handled it with grace, just like we taught you. but more importantly, you're turning it into something positive. We're so proud. As noon approached, Sarah gathered everyone in the terminal for an impromptu announcement. The crowd had grown to include airport staff, passengers, journalists who had managed to get in, and countless others who wanted to witness this moment. What happened this morning was unfortunate, Sarah began, her voice clear and strong, but it has shown us something important. Change doesn't just happen in boardrooms or through policy documents. Real change happens in moments like these, when we choose how to respond to discrimination and prejudice. She turned to look at Miller, who stood at the back of the crowd, still at his post but looking like he wanted to disappear. "Mr. Miller, could you join me up here, please?" The crowd parted as Miller, hesitant and pale, walked toward Sarah. Everyone expected her to publicly shame him. Instead, she did something that left the room in stunned silence. "Tomorrow, when I take over this terminal," Sarah announced, "Mr. Miller will become our first chief of diversity and security training. His first-hand experience with confronting his own biases will help us build a better, more inclusive aviation community." Miller's eyes filled with tears. "Ms. Bennett, I don't deserve this chance," he whispered. "This isn't just about you anymore," Sarah replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is about turning a moment of discrimination into a movement for change." The terminal erupted in applause. Phones recorded everything, and social media exploded with the hashtag Bennett effect, celebrating how one woman's grace under pressure was transforming a negative situation into positive change. As the afternoon sun filled the terminal with warm light, Sarah looked around at the unlikely community that had formed in just a few hours. Executives stood shoulder to shoulder with maintenance staff. Security personnel chatted with cleaning crews. The invisible barriers that had divided them for so long were finally beginning to crack. The support Sarah received that day wasn't just about one incident. It was about hope. Hope that change was possible, that grace could overcome prejudice, and that sometimes the best response to discrimination isn't anger, but action. By the next morning, the story of what happened at the private terminal had gone viral worldwide. Sarah Bennett sat in her new office overlooking the airport runway, watching planes take off into the clear blue sky. The wall-mounted TV showed various news channels, all running the same story: Aviation CEO transforms discrimination into change. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from James Miller, the security guard whose actions had started it all. "Miss Bennett, I couldn't sleep all night. I've spent hours watching the videos of how I behaved. I don't know how to face everyone today." Sarah picked up her phone and typed back, "Be here at 9 a.m. Your first day as Chief of Diversity and Security Training begins today." At exactly 9 a.m., Miller arrived at her office. He looked different from yesterday. His shoulders were slumped. His face showed signs of a sleepless night, and his usual confident stride was replaced by uncertain steps. "Please, sit down," Sarah said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, casting long shadows across the office floor. "Ms. Bennett," Miller began, his voice shaking, "the things I said yesterday, the way I acted. I've been watching the videos all night. I didn't realize. I never thought." Sarah raised her hand gently. "Mr. Miller, do you know why I didn't fire you?" He shook his head, unable to meet her eyes. "Because firing you would have been easy," she explained. "It would have made headlines for a day, maybe a week. People would have cheered. But what would it have changed?" She stood up and walked to the window, watching another plane take off. "The real work isn't in punishing people for their biases, Mr. Miller. It's in helping them recognize and overcome them." Just then, Sarah's assistant Jessica entered the office. "The diversity training team is here, and the airport board members are waiting in the conference room." Sarah turned back to Miller. "Are you ready to face the consequences of your actions?" Miller stood up, straightening his uniform. "Yes, ma'am. Whatever punishment you think is appropriate." "This isn't punishment, Mr. Miller. This is transformation." Sarah opened her office door, revealing a room full of people, airport staff, security personnel, and board members. "Everyone, meet your new colleague. Mr. Miller will be sharing his story today, and together, we're going to create a new training program." The next few hours were intense. Miller stood before the group, his voice growing stronger as he honestly shared his thoughts from yesterday, his assumptions, his biases, his mistakes. People listened, Some nodded in recognition of their own hidden prejudices, others wiped away tears. "I've worked security for 20 years, Miller said, his voice cracking. "And yesterday was the first time I truly saw how my own biases affected my work. How many other people have I wrongly judged? How many times have I made someone feel less than human?" Sarah watched from the back of the room as Miller's words touched hearts and opened minds. This was the real consequence she had hoped for, not punishment, but awakening. By afternoon, the group had drafted the outline of a new training program. It wasn't just about diversity. It was about humanity, about seeing people as people, not as stereotypes. As the day drew to a close, Miller approached Sarah one last time. "Miss Bennett, I need to ask. Why me? Why give me this chance?" Sarah smiled, remembering her father's words about turning negative situations into positive change. "Because sometimes, Mr. Miller, the people who need to learn the most are the best ones to teach others." The consequences of that day reached far beyond one security guard or one airport terminal. Within weeks, other airports began requesting copies of the training program. Airlines started sending their staff to learn from Miller's experience and Sarah's response. As the sun set over the runway, casting an orange glow across the terminal where it all began, Sarah realized that sometimes the biggest consequences come not from punishment, but from giving people the chance to change. The news channels were still running the story, but now with a different headline. "Airport discrimination incident leads to nationwide training program." The consequences of one guard's actions had indeed turned into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. 1 month after the incident, Sarah Bennett stood at the podium in the main conference hall of her newly acquired Vista Aviation headquarters. The room was packed with journalists, aviation industry leaders, and civil rights activists. The banner behind her read, "Launch of the Bennett Initiative for Inclusive Aviation." The morning light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the diverse faces in the audience. In the front row sat James Miller, looking transformed in his new business suit, a far cry from his security guard uniform of a month ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice strong and clear, "what happened to me at that terminal was not unique. What makes this story different is what we chose to do about it." She clicked a remote, and the screen behind her displayed statistics that made many in the audience gasp. In the past year alone, there were over 500 reported cases of discrimination at private aviation facilities across the country. And these are just the reported cases. The room fell silent as photos appeared on the screen. People of color being questioned unnecessarily, women being dismissed as pilots, and elderly passengers being treated rudely. "Today, that changes," Sarah announced. "The Bennett Initiative is committing $50 million to transform the aviation industry's approach to diversity and inclusion." James Miller stood up and joined Sarah at the podium. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was firm. "A month ago, I was the face of discrimination in aviation. Today, I stand before you as proof that people can change when given the right opportunity and education." Sarah smiled and continued, "Our initiative has 3 main components. First, mandatory diversity training for all aviation personnel, from security to pilots. Second, a scholarship program for minorities interested in aviation careers. And third, a reporting system that ensures every incident of discrimination is addressed properly." The audience listened intently as Sarah and Miller explained how the training program they had developed was already showing results. In just 1 month, customer satisfaction scores at their terminal had increased by 40%. "But this isn't just about numbers," Sarah explained. "It's about people, real stories, real change." She gestured to the back of the room, where Maria Gonzalez, the cleaning staff member who had spoken up a month ago, was now wearing a supervisor's badge. Maria stood up, her eyes shining with pride. "Thanks to the Bennett Initiative, I was able to enter the management training program. Now I supervise terminal operations and help train new staff about respect and dignity in the workplace." The cameras flashed as Sarah unveiled the initiative's logo, a pair of wings formed by diverse hands of different colors. This symbol represents what aviation should be, a force that lifts everyone up, regardless of their background. Then came the announcement that made headlines across the country. "Starting today," Sarah declared, "any aviation facility that wants to partner with Bennett Capital must adopt our inclusive training program. And yes, that includes over 200 private terminals nationwide. The room erupted in applause as Sarah introduced her next surprise. We're also launching the Future Wings program, providing full scholarships to 100 minority students each year to study aviation and airport management. James Miller stepped forward again, this time with tears in his eyes. Ms. Bennett didn't just change my life by giving me a second chance. She showed me how to help change others' lives too. As the presentation continued, Sarah shared stories of other airports that had already started implementing the program. Security incidents were down, customer satisfaction was up, and most importantly, people were talking openly about discrimination and how to prevent it. This initiative isn't just about airports, Sarah concluded. It's about changing the way we see each other. It's about recognizing that diversity isn't just a buzzword, it's our greatest strength. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes. As camera flashes filled the room, Sarah looked at the faces around her. Miller, now dedicated to teaching others. Maria, proudly wearing her supervisor's badge. Young aviation students in the audience, seeing a future full of possibilities. 1 month had passed since that morning at the terminal, but it felt like the beginning of something much bigger. The Bennett initiative wasn't just changing policies, it was changing hearts and minds, one person at a time. As Sarah looked out at the cheering crowd, she remembered her parents' words about turning negative situations into positive change. She had done more than that. She had started a movement that would reshape an entire industry. 6 months had passed since the incident at the terminal. On a bright autumn morning, Sarah Bennett sat in her office, reviewing a special report on her desk. The document detailed the incredible changes that had swept through the aviation industry since the launch of her initiative. The transformation had been remarkable, but none more so than in James Miller himself. Today was his 100th training session, and Sarah decided to attend personally. As she walked into the training room, she was amazed at what she saw. Miller stood confidently before a group of 50 aviation professionals, his former security guard uniform replaced by a sleek business suit. The nervous, prejudiced man from 6 months ago was gone. In his place stood someone entirely different. I was wrong, Miller began his session, his voice clear and strong. I was wrong about Ms. Bennett that day, but more importantly, I was wrong about everything I thought I knew about people who looked different from me. The room was silent as Miller shared his story. Security officers, pilots, flight attendants, and terminal managers all listened intently. Some took notes, others nodded in recognition of their own biases. 6 months ago, Miller continued, I almost ruined someone's day because of my prejudices. Instead, she showed me how to become a better person. Now, I want to help all of you do the same. Sarah watched from the back of the room as Miller conducted his training session. He used real examples, shared personal experiences, and encouraged honest discussions about bias and discrimination. The transformation in him was nothing short of miraculous. During the lunch break, Sarah received an email that brought tears to her eyes. The National Aviation Authority had officially adopted the Bennett Initiative's training program as a mandatory requirement for all U.S. airports. What had started as one painful incident had grown into national policy. Later that afternoon, Sarah visited the terminal where it all began. The change was visible everywhere. The staff was more diverse, the atmosphere more welcoming. Maria Gonzalez, now the terminal operations manager, greeted her with a warm hug. Ms. Bennett, Maria said proudly, yesterday we had our first female Muslim pilot come through. The way our staff treated her with respect and professionalism, it was beautiful to watch. The security checkpoint where Miller had once blocked Sarah's path now had a plaque on the wall. It read, Respect all, judge none. The Bennett Principle. Below it hung photos of the terminal's diverse staff members. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. It was from a young black woman who had received one of the Future Wings scholarships. Ms. Bennett, today I flew my first solo flight. Thank you for making it possible for people like me to reach for the sky. The transformation wasn't just in policies and procedures. It was in the small, everyday moments. It was in the way security staff now greeted everyone with the same respect. It was in the increasing number of minority pilots and aviation professionals. It was in the changing faces of airport leadership. That evening, Sarah organized a special dinner to celebrate Miller's 100th training session. The restaurant overlooked the airport runway, and the setting sun painted the sky in beautiful colors. During dinner, Miller stood up to make a speech. His hands weren't shaking anymore when he spoke. 6 months ago, I was the problem, he said, looking at Sarah. Today, thanks to you, I'm part of the solution. We trained over 5,000 aviation professionals. We changed countless minds, but most importantly, we changed hearts. The statistics backed up his words. Discrimination complaints had dropped by 70% across participating airports. Employee satisfaction had risen dramatically. The aviation industry was becoming what it should have been all along, a place where everyone could soar. As Sarah looked around the dinner table, she saw the physical proof of transformation. There sat Miller, the former biased security guard, now a respected diversity trainer. Next to him was Maria, who had risen from cleaning staff to management. Around them were pilots, executives, and staff members of all backgrounds, sharing meals and stories together. The transformation wasn't complete. There was still work to be done. But as Sarah watched a plane take off through the restaurant window, soaring into the darkening sky, she knew that the aviation industry would never be the same again. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest transformations come from the darkest moments. All it takes is the courage to choose change over anger, education over punishment, and hope over hate.